Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I love camping and hiking. There's something about the crisp mountain air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the gentle babbling of streams that speaks to my soul. It's a passion I've nurtured since childhood, but as I've grown older, I've found myself craving more intense experiences, pushing further into the wilderness, seeking out the most remote and untouched corners of nature. That's how I found myself driving my trusty old RV, Betsy, deep into the heart of the Catskill Mountains one crisp autumn morning. The foliage was at its peak, painting the landscape in a riot of reds, oranges, and golds. I'd spent months planning this trip, poring over topographical maps and scouring online forums for tips on the most secluded camping spots. My name is Gordon Weathers, and I've always been a bit of a loner. Don't get me wrong, I can navigate social situations when I need to, but I've never been one for crowded bars or bustling city streets. Give me a good book, a well-stocked tackle box, and the great outdoors, and I'm in my element. As I guided Betsy along the winding mountain roads, I felt the tension of city life melting away. The further I got from civilization, the more at peace I felt. I had my sights set on a particular spot, a small hidden lake that I'd read about on an obscure camping forum. It was said to be pristine, rarely visited due to its remote location and the challenging terrain surrounding it. After several hours of driving, including the last hour on a barely there dirt road that had Betsy groaning in protest, I finally caught a glimpse of water through the trees. My heart leapt with excitement as I carefully maneuvered the RV into a small clearing near the shore. The lake was everything I'd hoped for and more. Its surface was like polished glass, perfectly reflecting the surrounding pines and the cloudless sky above. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I stepped out of the RV, the only sounds were the gentle lapping of water at the shore and the occasional call of a distant bird. "This is it, Betsy," I said, patting the RV's worn exterior. "Our own little slice of paradise." I spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp. I deployed Betsy's awning, set out my folding chair and table, and organized my fishing gear. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I sat by the shore with a steaming mug of coffee, watching the light play across the water's surface. The peacefulness was almost overwhelming after months in the city. That night I slept better than I had in years, lulled to sleep by the gentle sounds of the forest. I awoke at dawn, eager to explore my surroundings. After a quick breakfast, I packed a day bag with water, snacks, and basic survival gear, and set off to hike the perimeter of the lake. The going was tough. There was no established trail, so I had to pick my way through dense underbrush and over fallen logs. But the challenge only added to my enjoyment. This was true wilderness, untamed and untouched. It was nearing midday when I stumbled upon something unexpected. Pushing through a particularly thick patch of ferns, I suddenly found myself in a small clearing. At its center stood a cabin. My first thought was disappointment. I'd hoped this area was completely uninhabited. But as I drew closer, I realized this building hadn't seen use in many years. The wood was weathered gray, the windows were broken or boarded up, and the roof sagged ominously. Nature was in the process of reclaiming it, with vines creeping up the walls and small saplings pushing through the rotted porch. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, testing each step on the porch before putting my full weight down. The door was ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I pushed it open, wincing at the loud creak that shattered the forest silence. The interior was a mess of decay and abandonment. What little furniture remained was in shambles. Leaves and other debris had blown in through the broken windows, coating everything in a layer of damp muck. The air was thick with the musty smell of rot and neglect. As I picked my way carefully through the cabin, my foot caught on something hidden beneath the leaves. I bent down to investigate and found myself lifting a trapdoor. A ladder descended into darkness below. I hesitated. Every horror movie I'd ever seen screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the explorer in me, the part that had driven me to seek out this remote location in the first place, urged me forward. I pulled out my flashlight and began to descend. The basement was surprisingly large and, unlike the floor above, remarkably well preserved. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dusty jars and cans. It looked like some sort of survival bunker. At the far end of the room, a small table held a leather-bound book. I approached, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The book turned out to be a journal. The name inside read, Walter Grimm. I began to read, and as I did, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the basement. Walter wrote of a darkness that haunted the forest, of creatures that prowled the night. His entries became increasingly frantic and paranoid. The final entry simply read, "They're coming. God help us all." I slammed the journal shut, suddenly very aware of how quiet it was, how far I was from any help. I quickly made my way back up the ladder, eager to be out of the cabin and back in the sunlight. As I emerged from the cabin, I realized with a start that the quality of light had changed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. I'd spent far longer in the cabin than I'd realized. I needed to get back to Betsy before full dark. I set off at a brisk pace, trying to retrace my steps, but in the fading light everything looked different. The shadows seemed to stretch and move in ways that made me question my sense of direction. More than once I found myself turning in circles, trying to get my bearings. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful this morning, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me jump. It was fully dark by the time I finally stumbled back into the clearing where I'd parked Betsy. I'd never been so glad to see the old RV. I quickly went inside, locked the door, and turned on every light I had. As I sat there trying to calm my racing heart, I told myself I was being silly. I was an experienced outdoorsman. I shouldn't let an old cabin and a cryptic journal spook me like this. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The darkness outside the windows of the RV seemed deeper, more absolute than it should have been. And in that darkness I could swear I heard movement. The soft crunch of footsteps on pine needles, the quiet rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I tried to convince myself it was just nocturnal animals going about their business. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural sound that was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was not the call of any animal I knew. I spent a sleepless night in Betsy, jumping at every sound, peering out the windows into the impenetrable darkness. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time in packing up and getting back on the road. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself that I was just letting my imagination run wild, that there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there in those woods, something that defied rational explanation. I still love camping and hiking, but these days I stick to more populated areas, well-maintained campgrounds with other people around. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking back to that remote lake in the Catskills, and I wonder about what might be lurking in the shadows of the pines. Months passed, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night in the Catskills. The experience had left its mark on me, altering my once peaceful sleep with vivid nightmares of shadowy figures and inhuman howls. I tried to dismiss it as an overactive imagination fueled by an old journal and the isolation of the wilderness, but deep down I knew there was more to it. My passion for the outdoors hadn't diminished, but it had changed. I found myself drawn to busy campgrounds and popular hiking trails, seeking safety in numbers. Yet even as I tried to convince myself I was content with these tamer adventures, I felt a nagging pull back to that secluded lake. It was early spring when I finally gave in to the compulsion. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that returning to the site in broad daylight would prove there was nothing to fear. I'd see it was just an ordinary forest, and I could put this whole thing behind me. I set out early one morning, leaving Betsy behind this time in favor of my more maneuverable Jeep. The drive was as I remembered it, the road becoming increasingly rough as I ventured deeper into the mountains. But something felt different. The forest seemed quieter, the birdsong muted and infrequent. As I neared the turnoff for the lake, I noticed something that made me slam on the brakes. There, half hidden by overgrown foliage, was a battered no trespassing sign. It looked old, but I was certain it hadn't been there during my previous visit. I sat in the idling jeep, debating whether to continue. Part of me wanted to turn back, to pretend I'd never come this far, but I'd come for answers, and I wasn't going to leave without them. I proceeded slowly, parking the jeep where I'd left Betsy months ago. The clearing looked much the same, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my backpack, making sure I had plenty of water, food, and my trusty flashlight. This time I also packed a can of bear spray. Not that I truly believed it would be effective against whatever might be out there, but its weight on my belt was reassuring. My first stop was the cabin. In the spring sunlight, it looked even more decrepit than I remembered. Nature had continued its relentless reclamation. The porch had partially collapsed, and a young tree was growing through a hole in the roof. I approached cautiously, testing each step. The floorboards groaned ominously underfoot as I made my way to the trap door. It took some effort to pry it open, the wood swollen with moisture. The basement was as I'd left it, the shelves of supplies untouched. I made my way to the table where I'd found Walter Grimm's journal, but it was gone. In its place was a small, tarnished key. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It was old, its design intricate and unfamiliar. What did it open? And who had left it here? A noise from above made me freeze. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the cabin floor. My heart raced as I stared up at the open trapdoor, expecting at any moment to see a face peer down at me. But nothing appeared. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered my courage and climbed the ladder, my hand tight around the bear spray. The cabin was empty, showing no signs of recent disturbance besides my own footprints in the dust. I emerged into the sunlight, my eyes darting around the clearing. There was no one in sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to follow the lakeshore, retracing my steps from the previous trip. As I walked, I noticed small details that seemed off. Claw marks on trees that were too high and too deep to be from any normal wildlife. Patches of vegetation that looked withered and blackened, as if something caustic had dripped on them. I was so focused on these anomalies that I almost missed the new structure. Half hidden by a stand of pines was a small stone building. It looked ancient, its rough-hewn blocks covered in moss and lichen. A heavy wooden door was set into one wall, secured by a rusted padlock. My hand went to the key in my pocket. Could it be? The key fit perfectly, though it took some effort to turn in the corroded lock. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire forest. The interior was a single room, illuminated by thin shafts of light from small, high windows. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding an assortment of strange objects. Oddly shaped bottles filled with murky liquids, bundles of dried herbs I didn't recognize, and small figurines carved from some dark wood. But it was the center of the room that drew my attention. A large stone table dominated the space, its surface covered in intricate carvings. They depicted scenes of rituals and strange, elongated figures that made my skin crawl. On the table lay a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. My hand shook as I opened it, revealing pages filled with dense text in a language I didn't recognize, interspersed with disturbing illustrations. I was so engrossed in the book that I didn't notice the change in light until the room had become noticeably darker. I looked up to see the sun setting outside. How long had I been in here? I quickly closed the book and made to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard voices outside. They were speaking in low, guttural tones, in a language that sounded like no earthly tongue I'd ever heard. I extinguished my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall beside the door, hardly daring to breathe. Through a crack, I could see shapes moving in the twilight. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to shift and waver as if they weren't fully solid. They gathered around the stone table, placing objects on its surface that writhed and pulsated in ways that made my stomach churn. One of them spoke, its voice a harsh, rasping sound that set my teeth on edge. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, watching this eldritch ritual unfold. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that small stone room. It was the sound of my own panicked breathing that finally snapped me out of my trance. I realized with horror that the figures had gone silent. Slowly, as one, They turned towards the door behind which I hid. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I burst through the door, not caring about stealth anymore, and ran headlong into the forest. Behind me, I heard inhuman shrieks and the sound of pursuit. I ran blindly through the darkening woods, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The sounds behind me grew closer, accompanied by an otherworldly glow that cast writhing shadows all around me. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke through the tree line into the clearing where I'd parked. I threw myself into the jeep, fumbling with the keys as the unearthly shrieks grew ever nearer. The engine roared to life and I slammed the accelerator to the floor. As I fishtailed onto the dirt road, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of something. A mass of writhing shadows with too many limbs and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. I drove recklessly, far too fast for the winding mountain roads, but fear kept my foot heavy on the gas. It wasn't until I reached the main highway, with its reassuring streetlights and occasional passing cars, that I finally began to slow down. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the outskirts of my city. As the familiar skyline came into view, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived, because now I knew. The darkness that Walter Grimm wrote about, the things that haunted that remote mountain lake, they were real, and somehow I knew this wasn't over. As I pulled into my driveway, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I made a decision. I couldn't just walk away from this, couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Whatever was happening in those mountains, it was spreading. Those withered patches of vegetation, the claw marks on the trees, signs of corruption seeping into our world. I had inadvertently stumbled upon something far bigger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. But now that I knew about it, I had a responsibility to warn others, to try to stop it, though I had no idea how. As I unlocked my front door, already planning my next move, a chill ran down my spine. On my welcome mat lay a single pine needle, its scent carrying me back to that forest. And I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that they had followed me home. This was only the beginning. The weeks following my return from the Catskills were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every unexpected sound set my heart racing. I threw myself into research, scouring the internet for any information on the symbols I'd seen, the rituals I'd witnessed. Most of what I found was useless, the ramblings of conspiracy theorists or role-playing game lore. But occasionally I'd come across something that resonated with my experience. Obscure folklore about entities that lived in the spaces between worlds. Historical accounts of entire villages disappearing overnight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince me I wasn't going crazy. I knew I needed help, but who could I possibly turn to? The police? They'd think I was insane. My friends and family? I couldn't bear to drag them into this nightmare. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I received the email. The sender was anonymous. The subject line simply read, "We know what you saw." My finger hovered over the delete button, assuming it was spam or a prank, but something made me open it. The message was brief. "You're not alone. Others have seen them too. If you want answers, come to the address below tomorrow at midnight. Come alone." Below was an address for a location in the industrial district of the city. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea. It could be a trap or worse, but I was desperate for answers, for some confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. The next night found me driving through the nearly deserted streets of the industrial district. The address turned out to be an old warehouse, its windows dark and its walls covered in graffiti. I parked a block away and approached on foot, every sense on high alert. As I neared the building, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old woman, her face deeply lined, her eyes sharp and alert. "Gordon Weathers?" she asked, her voice gravelly. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Follow me," she said, turning to enter the warehouse through a side door. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs. As my eyes adjusted, I saw a group of people gathered in a rough circle. They were an eclectic bunch, young and old, from various walks of life. But they all shared the same haunted look in their eyes that I saw in the mirror every day. The old woman introduced herself as Margaret and began to explain. They called themselves the Watchers. Each of them had encountered the entities in some way, in the deep woods, in abandoned urban spaces, in the liminal moments between sleep and waking. "We've been tracking their activities for years," Margaret said. "They're getting bolder, their incursions into our world more frequent." Over the next few hours, I listened to their stories, each one sending chills down my spine. A hiker who'd stumbled upon a ritual similar to what I'd seen. A urban explorer who'd found impossible geometries in an abandoned subway tunnel. A night security guard who'd seen things crawl out of the shadows that defied description. They had theories about what these entities were: interdimensional beings, ancient gods, manifestations of humanity's collective unconscious. But the truth was, they didn't know for sure. What they did know was that these things were a threat, not just to individuals, but to the very fabric of our reality. "We've managed to develop some defenses," a younger man named Alex explained. He showed me symbols that could ward off the entities, mixtures of herbs and minerals that seemed to repel them. But it wasn't enough. For every incursion they managed to stop, two more seemed to pop up. They were fighting a losing battle, and they knew it. "That's why we contacted you," Margaret said. "Your experience at the lake. It's a vital piece of the puzzle. We think that area might be a major focal point for their activities." They wanted me to go back, to help them set up monitoring equipment, to try to gather more information about what was happening there. The very thought made my blood run cold, but I knew I had to do it. This was bigger than my fear. As dawn broke, we made our plans. In a week's time, a small team of us would return to the Catskills. We'd be better prepared this time, armed with knowledge and tools to defend ourselves. At least that's what we told ourselves. As I drove home, my mind was reeling from everything I'd learned. I felt a mix of terror and strange excitement. I was part of something now, something important. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were hopelessly outmatched against whatever was out there. I arrived home just as the sun was fully rising. As I walked to my front door, a movement caught my eye. There, in a tree across the street, was a raven. It seemed to watch me with an intelligence that went beyond animal cunning. As I met its gaze, I could have sworn I saw its eyes glow with an otherworldly light. Then it spread its wings and took flight, disappearing into the morning sky. But its caw echoed in my ears, sounding almost like laughter. The battle for our world had begun, and I was now on the front lines. The week leading up to our return to the Catskills was a flurry of preparation. The Watchers provided me with a crash course in occult defense, how to draw protective sigils, how to make salts and herbs that repelled the entities, how to recognize signs of their presence. Our team consisted of 5 people: myself, Margaret, Alex, a former military guy named Mike, and a quiet woman named Sarah who claimed to be sensitive to supernatural energies. We loaded up 2 SUVs with cameras, sensors, and other monitoring equipment, along with enough supplies to last us a week. The drive up was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we neared the turnoff to the lake, Sarah suddenly gasped, her face pale. "They know we're coming," she whispered. We pressed on, but her words hung heavy in the air. The forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming unnaturally tall, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. We set up base camp near where I'd parked Betsy on my first trip. Mike began setting up a perimeter of protective wards while the rest of us unloaded the equipment. The plan was to spend the night here, then move deeper into the forest at first light. As darkness fell, an unnatural silence descended on the woods. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. The only sound was the crackling of our small fire and our own hushed voices. We took turns keeping watch through the night. During my shift, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving in the darkness beyond our wards, heard whispers in a language that hurt my ears to hear, but nothing breached our defenses. Dawn broke, gray and cheerless. We ate a quick breakfast and broke camp, heading towards the cabin in the stone building I'd discovered on my last trip. The trek was arduous. The undergrowth seemed thicker than I remembered, the ground treacherously uneven. More than once, one of us would stumble only to be caught by another team member. It felt like the forest itself was trying to impede our progress. We reached the cabin by midday. It looked even worse than before, the roof now completely caved in. But it was the stone building that drew our attention. It stood as I remembered it, ancient and foreboding. Sarah approached it cautiously, her hand outstretched. "The energy here, it's like nothing I've ever felt," she murmured. "It's old, so old." We set up our equipment around the building, cameras trained on the entrance, sensors to detect any unusual energy fluctuations. Mike and Alex began to draw protective circles around our setup, while Margaret consulted an old tome she'd brought, muttering incantations under her breath. I found myself drawn to the lake's edge. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. As I stared into its depths, I felt a strange pull, as if something beneath the surface was calling to me. "Gordon!" Margaret's sharp voice snapped me out of my trance. I turned to see the others gathered around the stone building, urgency in their expressions. "It's starting," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Can't you feel it?" As if in response to her words, a low rumble emanated from the ground beneath our feet. The still surface of the lake began to ripple, concentric circles spreading outward from the center. We scrambled to our positions, each of us clutching the protective amulets the watchers had provided. Mike started up the generators, flooding the area with harsh electric light. Alex manned the cameras while Margaret began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, her voice rising above the growing rumble. The door of the stone building swung open with a groan, revealing only inky darkness beyond. Sarah gasped, pointing at the threshold. "Look!" Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, writhing, elongated forms that hurt the eyes to look at directly. They moved with a fluidity that defied physics, oozing and stretching across the ground towards us. Our wards flared to life, lines of blue fire erupting along the boundaries Mike had laid down. The entities recoiled, hissing in voices that sounded like radio static. For a moment, I dared to hope that our defenses would hold, but then I saw it. A massive tentacle as thick as a tree trunk, erupting from the center of the lake. It was followed by another, and another, until the water churned with thrashing limbs. "It's coming through," Alex shouted, his camera trained on the lake. "The water, it's a gateway." Margaret's chanting grew more frantic, the words seeming to physically push back the encroaching darkness. But I could see the strain on her face, the trembling in her hands. A scream tore through the air. Sarah had collapsed, blood trickling from her nose and ears. "Too much," she gasped. "The veil, it's tearing." The sky above us began to warp, the clouds swirling into impossible shapes. Through gaps in the twisting vapor I caught glimpses of something else. A vast alien sky filled with unfamiliar stars and looming shapes that dwarfed mountains. Our reality was coming apart at the seams. In that moment of horror and awe, a strange calm settled over me. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the book from Margaret's hands, ignoring her cry of protest. The pages fell open, revealing symbols that burned themselves into my mind. Without fully understanding how, I began to read. The words felt ancient and powerful, resonating in my chest as I spoke them. I felt something stir within me, a connection to forces beyond my comprehension. The entities shrieked, a sound that threatened to shatter my eardrums. The tentacles in the lake thrashed more violently, sending waves crashing against the shore. But I pressed on, my voice growing stronger with each word. The symbols on the page began to glow, lifting off the paper and swirling around me in a vortex of light. I felt a tugging sensation, as if my very essence was being pulled in two directions. Part of me wanted to let go, to allow myself to be swept away into whatever lay beyond. But I gritted my teeth and focused on the here and now, on the world I was fighting to protect. With a final thunderous word, I felt something snap. There was a blinding flash of light, a sensation of unimaginable pressure, and then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself standing alone by the lake. The stone building was gone, leaving only a scorched patch of earth. The sky was clear, the water calm. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I could feel it in the air, in the earth beneath my feet. A change had occurred, fundamental and irreversible. I found the others unconscious but alive. As they came to, their eyes held a mix of confusion, awe, and fear as they looked at me. "What did you do?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse. I shook my head, unable to fully articulate what had transpired. "I closed the door," I said simply, "but I don't think it can ever be fully shut again." We made our way back to civilization in a daze, each lost in our own thoughts. The world looked the same, but we knew it had been forever altered. The veil between realities had been stretched thin, and though we had prevented a full incursion, the barrier would never be as strong again. In the months and years that followed, we remained vigilant. Strange occurrences began to pop up around the world with increasing frequency, unexplained phenomena, glimpses of things that shouldn't exist. The Watchers grew, evolving into a global network dedicated to maintaining the increasingly fragile barriers between worlds. As for me, I was changed. The power I had wielded that day left its mark. I found I could sense the weak spots, the places where the veil was thinnest. It became my role to travel to these locations, to shore up the defenses and push back against the encroaching darkness. I never returned to that lake in the Catskills, but sometimes, in my dreams, I find myself standing on its shore, gazing into waters that reflect alien skies. And I wonder, did I truly close the door that day, or merely delay the inevitable? The wilderness still calls to me, but now I answer that call with a mixture of love and trepidation, for I know that in the deepest, darkest corners of the world, ancient forces stir, and we, the Watchers, are all that stand between humanity and the chaos that lurks just beyond the veil. As I sit here penning this account, I can't help but glance out my window at the deepening twilight. Was that a flicker of movement in the shadows, a whisper on the wind? I shake off the paranoia and return to my writing. There are others out there who need to know, who might one day find themselves face to face with the unknown. To them I say this: the world is stranger and more dangerous than you can imagine. But there is also wonder and power beyond belief. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and if you ever find yourself in a remote wilderness, feeling eyes upon you from the darkness, run, and don't look back. For not all who wander in the wild places of the world are lost, some are merely waiting. I love camping and hiking. There's something about the great outdoors that speaks to my soul, offering a respite from the chaos of city life. My name is Max Dennison, and I've always felt more at home among towering trees and babbling brooks than in the concrete jungle. Little did I know that my passion for nature would lead me into a nightmare beyond my wildest imagination. It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at the secluded campsite in the dense forests of Oregon. The fog hung low, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as I carefully maneuvered my RV down the narrow dirt road. I had chosen this particular spot for its promise of solitude, eager to disconnect from the world and recharge my batteries. As I pulled into the small clearing that would serve as my home for the next few days, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a welcome change from the polluted city air I was used to. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment as I stepped out of the RV. The campsite was perfect, a level patch of ground surrounded by towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Their branches formed a natural canopy overhead, filtering the weak sunlight and casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. In the distance I could hear the faint sound of a stream, its gentle burbling adding to the serene environment. I spent the next hour setting up camp, relishing the physical labor after months of being cooped up in my office. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. I chalked it up to the local wildlife, probably curious about their new neighbor. With the RV situated and my gear unpacked, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I grabbed my backpack, filled a water bottle, and set off down a narrow trail that wound its way deeper into the forest. As I walked, the fog began to lift, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce through the canopy. The trail was well maintained, but clearly not frequently used. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and the occasional branch snagged at my clothes. Despite the beauty of my surroundings, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire wood was holding its breath, waiting for something. About an hour into my hike, I came across a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its weathered planks gray with age. Windows, their glass long since shattered, gaped like empty eye sockets. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, the floorboards of the sagging porch creaking ominously under my weight. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and it took some effort to push it open. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the acrid scent of decay. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. The cabin was mostly empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture and what looked like animal droppings scattered across the floor. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, something on the far wall caught my attention. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a collection of photographs, yellowed with age and curling at the edges. They were pinned haphazardly to the wall, forming a disturbing collage. The photos showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. In the earliest images they were smiling, apparently happy, but as I examined the photos in sequence, I noticed a change. The smiles became forced, then disappeared entirely. In the final few pictures, their eyes were wide with fear, their faces gaunt and haggard. The last photo in the sequence made my blood run cold. It showed the same family, but their bodies were twisted and broken, arranged in a grotesque tableau. Their eyes had been gouged out, leaving dark, empty sockets that seemed to stare directly at me. I stumbled backward, my stomach churning. This was wrong. This was deeply, terribly wrong. I had to get out of here, had to contact the authorities. As I turned to leave, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the cabin was empty. Just my imagination playing tricks on me, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I practically ran from the cabin, not stopping until I was back on the main trail. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Those photos, they couldn't be real, could they? Maybe it was some sick joke, a prank set up to scare hikers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The trek back to my campsite seemed to take an eternity. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. By the time I stumbled into the clearing where my RV was parked, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. I locked myself in the RV, double-checking every window and door. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my cell phone, intending to call the local sheriff's office. But there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and mountains. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The wind whispered through the trees, branches scratching against the sides of the RV like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance an animal howled. At least I hoped it was an animal. Sleep was out of the question. I sat at the small table, a cup of cold coffee in front of me, my eyes glued to the windows. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A low, guttural moan, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. It was close, too close. My breath caught in my throat as a shadow passed by the window. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay put, I grabbed a flashlight and my hunting knife. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and stepped out into the night. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty campsite and looming trees. Then I saw it, a trail of something dark and wet leading into the forest. My stomach lurched as I realized it was blood. Fresh blood, still glistening in the beam of my flashlight. Every fiber of my being told me to run, to get in the RV and drive as fast and as far as I could. But I couldn't. If someone was hurt, I had to help. I followed the trail, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. The blood led me to a small clearing, and what I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. A body, or what was left of one, lay sprawled on the forest floor. It had been torn apart, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, the chest cavity ripped open. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a nightmare. In my shock and horror, I failed to notice the figure approaching from behind until it was too late. Something hard struck the back of my head and the world went dark. When I came to, I was back in the RV, but everything had changed. My hands and feet were bound with coarse rope, cutting into my skin. My head throbbed, and I could taste blood in my mouth. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of my situation. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek. His eyes were cold and empty, devoid of any humanity. He regarded me for a moment before speaking, his voice low and menacing. "You're awake. Good. We need to have a little chat, Max." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. How did he know my name? "Who are you?" I managed to croak out. "What do you want?" He chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. "Who I am doesn't matter. What matters is that you've seen things you shouldn't have." He pulled something from his pocket, a small blood-stained photograph. With a jolt, I recognized it as one of the pictures from the cabin. "You saw these, didn't you?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "These people, they were my family. We lived here in peace until they came. Hunters, they called themselves, but they weren't hunting animals." My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. The family in the photos, the brutalized body in the woods, it was all connected. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His lips curled into a cruel smile. "You, Max, are going to help me finish what I started. Those hunters took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from them, and you're going to be my instrument of vengeance." As he spoke, he pulled out a wicked-looking knife, its blade glinting in the dim light of the RV. I struggled against my bonds, but they were too tight. The man approached, the knife raised, and I knew with terrible certainty that my love for the outdoors had led me into a nightmare from which I might never wake. The man's words hung in the air, heavy with malice. I struggled against my bonds, the rough rope chafing my skin. "You're insane," I spat, trying to mask my fear with anger. "You can't seriously think you'll get away with this." He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the confined space of the RV. "Oh, Max, I've been getting away with it for years. You have no idea how many unfortunate accidents have happened in these woods." He leaned in close, his breath hot on my face. "And you're going to be my masterpiece." As he spoke, he began laying out an array of tools on the small table: knives, pliers, a rusted saw. My stomach churned at the sight. This was real. This was happening. "Why me?" I asked, desperately trying to buy time to find a way out of this nightmare. "Why not just kill me like the others?" The man paused, considering. "You're different, Max. You saw the photos, you know the truth, and now you're going to help me send a message." He picked up a knife, testing its edge with his thumb. "Those hunters, they think they're safe in their comfortable homes, their fancy cars. They've forgotten the pain they caused, but you're going to remind them. We're going to make a little film, you and I. Show them what real fear looks like." My mind raced, searching for a way out. The RV suddenly felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in. I noticed my backpack in the corner, its contents spilled across the floor. Among them was my cell phone. Useless without signal, but maybe... "You won't get away with this," I said, trying to keep his attention on me. "People will come looking for me. They'll find you." He smirked. "By the time anyone realizes you're missing, there won't be enough left of you to find." He turned away, reaching for something in a duffel bag. This was my chance. I threw myself sideways, toppling the chair I was bound to. Pain shot through my shoulder as I hit the floor, but I ignored it, frantically wriggling towards my phone. The man whirled around, cursing. I managed to grab the phone with my bound hands, frantically hitting the emergency call button. Even without signal, it might still work. A boot came down hard on my hand and I cried out in pain. The man wrenched the phone away, his face contorted with rage. "You shouldn't have done that," he snarled. What happened next was a blur of pain and terror. Blows rained down and I tasted blood. Through the haze of agony I heard a sound that made my heart leap. Sirens, distant but growing closer. The man heard them too. He hesitated, looking from me to the door and back again. For a moment I thought he might finish me off right there, but self-preservation won out. With a final vicious kick to my ribs, he grabbed his bag and bolted from the RV. I lay there, every breath sending shards of pain through my body. The sirens grew louder, then stopped. Car doors slammed and voices called out. I tried to respond, but could only manage a weak groan. The RV door burst open and flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "In here," a voice shouted. "We need a medic." As hands gently cut away my bonds and assessed my injuries, I caught fragments of conversation. Emergency signal. Lucky we were already in the area. Escaped convict. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by unconsciousness. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body a patchwork of bandages and bruises. A kindly-looking nurse was checking my vitals. "Welcome back," she said with a smile. "You gave us quite a scare." Over the next few days, I pieced together what had happened. The emergency call had gone through, alerting local authorities to my location. By sheer luck, a team had been in the area, searching for an escaped convict, my attacker, as it turned out. His name was Robert Grayson, a man with a long history of violence. He had escaped from a maximum security prison 2 weeks earlier, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. The hunters he spoke of were the jury members from his original trial. As I recovered, I gave statement after statement to police, park rangers, and FBI agents. They found the cabin I had discovered, along with evidence of Grayson's other victims. It was a horror show, one that would haunt the dreams of even the most hardened investigators. Grayson himself had vanished into the vast Oregon wilderness. Despite an extensive manhunt, he remained at large, a shadow lurking in the forests. Weeks passed, and eventually I was discharged from the hospital. But returning to normal life proved impossible. Every shadow held a potential threat. Every creak in my apartment sent my heart racing. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, now felt like a looming presence full of hidden dangers. I tried therapy, medication, even moving to a new city, but the memories persisted, as did the fear. Grayson was still out there, somewhere, and deep down I knew our paths would cross again. It was a crisp autumn evening, almost a year to the day since my ordeal, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. With trembling hands, I answered. "Hello, Max," a chillingly familiar voice said. "Did you miss me? Because I've missed you, and I always finish what I start." The line went dead, leaving me in stunned silence. As I stared out my window at the darkening sky, I knew with grim certainty that my nightmare was far from over. It had only just begun. The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. Grayson's voice echoed in my ears, a sinister promise that sent ice through my veins. I stumbled to the window, scanning the street below with frantic eyes. Was he out there watching me even now? My first instinct was to run, to pack a bag and disappear into the night. But a small, defiant part of me rebelled against the idea. I was tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. It was time to end this one way or another. With shaking hands, I picked up my phone and dialed the number of Special Agent Sarah Reeves, the FBI agent who had been assigned to my case. She answered on the second ring. "Dennison, what's wrong?" Her voice was alert, professional. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "He called me, Agent Reeves. Grayson. He's coming for me." There was a moment of silence on the other end. When Reeves spoke again, her voice was tense. "Are you sure it was him?" "Positive," I replied. "I'd never forget that voice." "Okay, don't panic. We're going to get a trace on that call. In the meantime, I'm sending a team to your location. Don't go anywhere, understand?" I nodded, then remembered she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I understand." The next few hours were a blur. FBI agents swarmed my apartment, setting up surveillance equipment and briefing me on security protocols. Agent Reeves arrived, her face grim as she listened to the recording of Grayson's call. "We've got a general location on the call," she said, spreading a map out on my kitchen table. "It came from a cell tower near Mount Hood National Forest." My stomach dropped. "He's back there, where it all started." Reeves nodded. "Looks that way, and I think I know why." She pointed to a spot on the map. "There's an old hunting lodge here. It was owned by the family of one of the jurors from Grayson's trial. I think he's using it as a base of operations." I stared at the map, memories of my ordeal flooding back. The dense forests, the isolated cabin, the terror of being hunted. Could I really go back there? As if reading my thoughts, Reeves placed a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this, Max. We can put you in protective custody, move you to a safe house." I shook my head. "No, this ends now. I want to be there when you take him down." Reeves studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you stay with me at all times, understood? This isn't about revenge. It's about justice." The next day, we set out for Mount Hood National Forest. As we drove through the winding mountain roads, I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We set up base camp a few miles from the hunting lodge, well out of sight. A team of FBI agents dressed in tactical gear prepared for the assault. I sat in one of the command vehicles, my heart pounding as I watched the preparations. As night fell, Reeves approached me. "We're moving out in 10 minutes. Last chance to back out." I shook my head. "I'm seeing this through." She handed me a bulletproof vest. "Put this on, and remember, stay behind me at all times." We moved through the forest like ghosts, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles. As we neared the lodge, I could see a faint light glowing from one of the windows. Reeves held up a hand, signaling the team to stop. She turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in there. We're going to surround the building, then move in. You stay here with Agent Collins." I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. As I watched Reeves and her team disappear into the darkness, a chill ran down my spine. Something felt off. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Agent Collins was gone. Before I could call out, a hand clamped over my mouth. "Hello, Max," Grayson's voice hissed in my ear. "I told you I'd finish what I started." I struggled, but Grayson was too strong. He dragged me deeper into the forest, away from the FBI team. I could hear shouts in the distance. They had realized something was wrong. "Your FBI friends are in for a nasty surprise," Grayson chuckled. "That lodge? It's rigged to blow. By the time they realize I'm not in there, it'll be too late." Terror gripped me as I realized the full extent of Grayson's plan. He had lured us all here, setting a trap that would eliminate both me and the FBI team in one fell swoop. As we reached a small clearing, Grayson spun me around to face him. In the dim moonlight, I could see the madness in his eyes. He raised a knife, its blade glinting ominously. "Any last words, Max?" he sneered. In that moment, something inside me snapped. All the fear, all the trauma of the past year crystallized into a single burning point of rage. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I lashed out, catching Grayson off guard. We grappled in the darkness, rolling on the forest floor. The knife clattered away, lost in the underbrush. Grayson's hands found my throat, squeezing with murderous intent. Spots danced in my vision as I struggled for air. My hand closed around something solid, a rock. With the last of my strength, I swung it, connecting with Grayson's temple. He went limp, collapsing on top of me. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, gasping for breath. In the distance, I heard an explosion, the lodge, then shouting. Flashlight beams cut through the trees. "Here," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." Agent Reeves burst into the clearing, her gun drawn. She took in the scene, me battered and bruised, and Grayson's unconscious form beside me. As the FBI team secured Grayson and paramedics tended to my injuries, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. Really, truly over. In the days that followed, the full story came to light. Grayson had indeed rigged the lodge to explode, but the FBI team had discovered the trap in time. Agent Collins, it turned out, had been knocked unconscious and tied up, not far from where Grayson had ambushed me. As I gave my final statement to Agent Reeves, she regarded me with a mix of admiration and concern. "You took a hell of a risk, Max, but you helped us bring a dangerous criminal to justice. You should be proud." I nodded, but pride wasn't what I felt. Instead, there was a sense of closure, of a chapter finally ending. As I walked out of the FBI office for the last time, I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. The forest had once been my sanctuary, then my nightmare. Now, as I looked at the trees lining the street, I felt something new, respect. Nature, I realized, was neither good nor evil. It simply was. And I, like the trees, had weathered the storm and come out stronger. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. The whispers in the woods had finally fallen silent, and it was time for me to write a new story. I love camping and hiking, I've never been one to shy away from adventure, which is probably why I found myself in the middle of nowhere, out RV camping by Crystal Lake, nestled in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Reuben Palmer, and I've seen my share of life's ups and downs, enough to know that sometimes you just need a break from everything. This trip was supposed to be my break, my time to unwind and reconnect with nature. As I drove my rented RV along the winding forest road, the towering pines seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and I was relying on the old-fashioned paper map I'd picked up at the last gas station. The sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. I finally spotted the small wooden sign for Crystal Lake Campground, barely visible in the fading light. The gravel crunched under the RV's tires as I turned onto the narrow access road. The campground was more rustic than I'd expected, with only a handful of RV spots scattered around the perimeter of the lake. I chose a spot far from the few other campers I'd seen on my way in, wanting to fully immerse myself in the solitude of nature. As I maneuvered the RV into place, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. No distant traffic, no hum of electricity. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional splash from the lake. Once parked, I stepped out and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The lake was a perfect mirror of the sky, clear and still. I set up my chair, grabbed a beer from the cooler, and settled in to enjoy the serene view. The only sounds were the distant call of a loon and the gentle rustling of leaves. It was perfect. As twilight deepened into night, I cooked up a small dinner on the portable grill and watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs, a symphony that lulled me into a sense of peace. I was about to turn in for the night when a noise caught my attention. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a faint, distant cry. It sounded almost human. A chill ran down my spine as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction it had come from. Silence fell over the campsite once more, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I zipped up the RV door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the RV keeping me on edge. Every snap of a twig outside sent my heart racing. It was well past midnight when I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep. I awoke with a start, disoriented in the darkness of the RV. Something had woken me, a sound. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. There it was again, a scream. This time there was no mistaking it. It was a human voice, filled with terror and pain. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my flashlight and phone. The screen showed no signal. Of course, we were in the middle of nowhere. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and the nagging feeling that someone out there needed help. Finally, I made my decision. I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I pulled on my boots and jacket, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped out into the night. The forest was different in the darkness, transformed into a realm of shadows and whispers. My flashlight beam seemed feeble against the pressing blackness. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and insignificant in the vast night. No response came, but as I moved deeper into the woods, I heard something else. A rustling, too deliberate to be the wind. Footsteps, and they were coming closer. I swung my flashlight around wildly, trying to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was out there. The beam glanced off something pale and round, hanging from a low branch. As I moved closer, my blood ran cold. It was a mask, crudely fashioned to resemble a human face, its empty eye sockets staring back at me. That's when I heard the whisper right behind me. "Welcome to our game, Reuben." I whirled around, but there was nothing there. How did they know my name? Panic seized me and I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sound of pursuit close behind. I could hear them laughing, enjoying the chase. I burst into a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. In the center stood a figure, tall and motionless, wearing one of those horrifying masks. As I watched, frozen in terror, more figures emerged from the trees surrounding me. They wore dark clothing and each carried a wickedly sharp knife. "What do you want?" I gasped, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The figure in the center tilted its head, the mask catching the moonlight. "We want to play," it said, in a voice that was almost childlike in its glee, "and you're it." As they closed in around me, I realized with horrifying clarity that this was no longer about survival. This was a game to them, and I was nothing more than prey. I made a desperate lunge, managing to break through their circle. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches tearing at my clothes, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear them behind me, whooping and calling, thoroughly enjoying the hunt. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, driven by pure adrenaline and the will to survive. In the distance I could see a faint light, my RV. If I could just make it there, maybe I'd have a chance. As I burst out of the tree line, I realized my mistake. They'd been hurting me, driving me right back to where I'd started. The RV door hung open, and I could see that the inside had been ransacked. I skidded to a halt, frantically looking for an escape route. That's when I saw it, a small motorboat tied up at the lake's edge. Without hesitation, I sprinted towards it, praying it had fuel. I reached the boat just as the masked figures emerged from the forest. My trembling hands fumbled with the rope, finally managing to untie it. I yanked the cord to start the engine, relief flooding through me as it roared to life. As I steered the boat out onto the dark waters of Crystal Lake, I could see them standing on the shore, their masked faces turned towards me. They made no move to pursue, simply watching as I sped away into the night. The adrenaline began to wear off as I reached the center of the lake, leaving me shaking and nauseous. What had just happened? Who were those people, and why had they targeted me? I cut the engine, letting the boat drift as I tried to catch my breath and think. The night was eerily silent now, the water around me black as ink. I had no idea which direction led to safety or if there was any safe place left. As I sat there trying to decide what to do next, a sound drifted across the water. Singing, a chorus of voices, childlike and innocent, singing a lullaby I half remembered from my own childhood. The melody sent chills down my spine. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. There, on the shore I'd just fled from, I could make out a line of small figures. Children, it seemed, standing hand in hand at the water's edge. But something was wrong with their proportions, their movements too jerky and unnatural. As I watched in horror, the children began to wade into the lake, still singing. They moved with unnatural speed, and I realized with a jolt of terror that they were coming towards me. I yanked the cord to restart the engine, but it sputtered and died. I tried again and again, panic rising as the singing grew louder. The boat rocked as something bumped against it from below. A small, pale hand reached over the side of the boat, its fingers unnaturally long and tipped with sharp claws. As I stared, frozen in terror, a face rose from the water, a child's face, but wrong somehow, its features twisted and inhuman. It smiled at me, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Time to play," it said in a gurgling voice. I screamed as more hands grasped the boat, rocking it violently. Water sloshed over the sides as the creatures, for they couldn't be human children, tried to climb aboard. I grabbed an oar, swinging it wildly to fend them off. In my panic, I didn't notice the larger shape moving beneath the boat until it was too late. With a tremendous crash, something huge breached the surface, capsizing the small craft and sending me plunging into the icy water. I thrashed in the darkness, disoriented and terrified. Something brushed against my leg and I kicked out frantically. My head broke the surface and I gasped for air, trying to spot the shore in the darkness. A sound behind me made me turn, and I found myself face to face with a massive serpentine head rising from the water. Its eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and its mouth gaped open, revealing row upon row of dagger-like teeth. I swam for my life, my arms and legs burning with the effort. Behind me I could hear the thing moving through the water, gaining on me with every second. The shore seemed impossibly far away. Just as I felt the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, my feet touched the bottom. I staggered onto the beach, collapsing on the sand as I turned to face my pursuer. But there was nothing there. The lake was calm and still, showing no sign of the monster that had chased me. Had I imagined it all? As I lay there, panting and shivering, I became aware of presences around me. I looked up to see the masked figures standing in a circle looking down at me. They were perfectly still, their blank mask faces betraying no emotion. "Congratulations," said the one I recognized as the leader. "You've made it to the next level." As unconsciousness claimed me, I realized with dawning horror that my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. I awoke to the sound of birdsong, sunlight streaming through the trees. For a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare, but as I sat up, wincing at the pain in my battered body, I knew it had been all too real. I was lying on the beach where I'd collapsed, but there was no sign of the masked figures or the monstrous children. The lake sparkled innocently in the morning light, giving no hint of the horrors it had held the night before. Stiffly, I got to my feet and looked around. My RV was where I'd left it, the door still hanging open. But when I approached, I saw that the interior had been put back in order. There was no sign of the ransacking I'd seen the night before. On the small table inside, I found a note written in elegant script. "Well played, Reuben. You've passed the first test, but the game is far from over. We'll be watching. Sweet dreams." I crumpled the note in my fist, a mix of anger and fear churning in my gut. Who were these people? What kind of sick game were they playing? I wanted nothing more than to jump in the RV and drive away as fast as I could. But as I looked at the winding road leading out of the campground, I hesitated. What if that was part of their plan? What if they were waiting for me out there? And what about the other campers I'd seen when I arrived? Had they been part of this twisted game too? Or were they innocent victims like me? I couldn't just leave them here. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. I tried the RV's radio, but got nothing but static on every channel. It seemed I was well and truly cut off from the outside world. As the full weight of my situation settled on me, I sank into the RV's small kitchenette chair, my mind racing. I had no idea what these people wanted from me or why they had chosen me for their game. But one thing was clear. If I wanted to survive, I would have to play along, at least for now. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves and think rationally. I needed a plan. First things first, I had to secure the RV as best I could. I spent the next hour reinforcing the door and windows with what I had on hand. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. Next, I took stock of my supplies. I had enough food and water to last a few days if I rationed carefully. The first aid kit was well stocked, which was a small mercy given the cuts and bruises I'd acquired during the night. As I tended to my wounds, I tried to make sense of what had happened. The masked figures were terrifying, but at least they were human. But those things in the lake, I shuddered at the memory. How could such creatures exist? And how had no one ever reported seeing them before? A movement outside caught my eye, and I froze. Through the RV window, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was a child, a normal-looking child this time, not like the monstrosities from the lake. She stood perfectly still, staring at me with an unnervingly blank expression. I blinked, and she was gone. Had I imagined her? Was my mind starting to play tricks on me? As the day wore on, I found myself jumping at every sound, peering nervously out the windows at every shadow. The forest that had seemed so peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. I knew they were out there, watching me, waiting for their next move. As the sun began to set, my dread grew. What horrors would the coming night bring? I didn't want to find out, but I knew I had no choice. This was their game, and for now, I had to play by their rules. I checked my makeshift fortifications one last time, and settled in for another sleepless night. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed. Was that just the wind in the trees or whispered voices? Was that creak just the RV settling, or footsteps on the roof? I clutched my improvised weapon, a kitchen knife taped to the end of a broom handle, and waited, every nerve on edge. Whatever came, I would be ready. I had to be. Because in this game, losing meant more than just defeat. It meant death. The night stretched on, each hour feeling like an eternity. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, inhuman shrieks, haunting laughter, and once what sounded like my own voice calling out in pain. I knew it was all part of their psychological warfare, but knowing didn't make it any less terrifying. As dawn approached, I felt myself starting to drift off, exhaustion finally overpowering fear. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping at the door. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped my makeshift spear tighter, holding my breath. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. Then a child's voice spoke. "Mr. Palmer, are you awake? I'm lost. Can you help me?" Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if there really was a lost child out there? Could I live with myself if I turned away someone who genuinely needed help? Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. Through the small window, I could see a small figure standing outside. It looked like a normal little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with pigtails and a tear-stained face. She looked up at me pleadingly. "Please, mister, I'm scared." My hand hesitated on the door handle. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me not to open the door. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, wasn't it? With a deep breath, I made my decision. I opened the door. The girl's face split into a wide grin, far too wide to be natural. Her eyes began to glow with an eerie light, and her form seemed to shimmer and twist. "Thank you for inviting me in," the girl said, her voice distorting into something inhuman. "Now the real fun can begin." I stumbled backward, my makeshift spear clattering to the floor. The girl's form continued to twist and grow, her limbs elongating impossibly. In seconds, she had transformed into a nightmarish creature that barely fit inside the RV. I scrambled for the spear, but a long, clawed hand wrapped around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I was dragged across the floor, my fingernails leaving scratches in the linoleum as I desperately tried to find purchase. The creature lifted me effortlessly, bringing me face to face with what had once been a little girl. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The stench of decay washed over me and I gagged. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out. The creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture. "Because it's fun," it said simply. Then it threw me. I crashed through the RV window, shards of glass slicing into my skin as I hit the ground outside. Pain lanced through my body, but adrenaline kept me moving. I staggered to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. The forest was a blur around me as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Behind me, I could hear the creature's inhuman shrieks as it gave chase. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond away. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. Suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. I came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered. As I tried to orient myself, I realized I was lying next to a small stream. The water gurgled peacefully, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few minutes. For a moment, all was quiet. Had I lost the creature? I held my breath, listening intently. Nothing. Slowly, painfully, I pulled myself to my feet. In the pre-dawn light, I could just make out my surroundings. The embankment I'd fallen down was steep, almost cliff-like. To my right, the stream flowed into what looked like the mouth of a cave. I hesitated. The cave could be a good hiding place, but it could also be a dead end. Before I could decide, I heard a blood-curdling screech from above. The creature had found me. Without further hesitation, I plunged into the cave. The darkness swallowed me whole as I stumbled forward, one hand on the damp wall to guide me. Behind me, I could hear the creature scrambling down the embankment, its claws scraping against rock. The cave narrowed, forcing me to squeeze through tight passages. My clothes caught on sharp rocks, tearing. My breath came in ragged gasps, echoing off the stone walls. Suddenly, my questing hand met empty air. The passage opened up into a larger cavern. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of the cavern were covered in crude paintings, stick figures being chased by monstrous shapes, scenes of torture and dismemberment, and everywhere a symbol that looked like an eye inside a triangle. A soft glow emanated from the far end of the cavern. As I approached, I saw that it came from a pool of water. The liquid glowed with an unearthly blue light, casting eerie shadows around the cave. I had only a moment to take this in before I heard the creature entering the cavern behind me. In desperation, I dove into the glowing pool. The water was icy cold, shocking the breath from my lungs. I expected to hit bottom quickly, but instead found myself sinking deeper and deeper. The glowing liquid surrounded me, and a strange tingling sensation spread across my skin. Just as my lungs were about to burst, my feet touched solid ground. I pushed off, rocketing to the surface. As my head broke the water, I gasped for air, blinking the luminescent liquid from my eyes. I found myself in another cave, lit by the same eerie blue glow. But this one was different. The air felt charged with energy, and strange symbols floated in the air, shimmering like heat mirages. As I pulled myself out of the pool, I noticed something else. The cuts and bruises I'd accumulated during my flight through the forest were gone. My body felt renewed, somehow. Stronger. "Welcome, Reuben," a voice said behind me. "We've been expecting you." I whirled around to find myself face to face with a group of people. They wore robes adorned with the same eye and triangle symbol I'd seen in the other cave. Their faces were kind, but their eyes held an otherworldly wisdom that made me shiver. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The apparent leader, an elderly man with a long white beard, stepped forward. "We are the Guardians," he said. "And this is the Nexus, the place where all realities converge." My mind reeled. "I don't understand." The old man smiled gently. "The creatures you encountered, the game you've been forced to play, they are not of your world. They are invaders from another reality, one where the laws of nature are different. We've been fighting them for centuries," a woman added, "keeping them contained, protecting your world and countless others from their influence. But lately they've grown stronger. The barriers between worlds are weakening." I shook my head, trying to process this information. But why me? Why was I chosen for this game? The old man's expression grew serious. "Because you have a gift, Reuben, a strength of will that allowed you to resist their influence, to see through their illusions. It's why you were able to find the Nexus." "We need your help," another guardian said, "to turn the tide, to push back the darkness." I laughed bitterly. "Me? I'm nobody. I couldn't even protect myself, let alone other worlds." The old man placed a hand on my shoulder. I felt a surge of energy flow through me. "You are far more than you know, Reuben, and you have a choice to make. You can return to your world, try to forget what you've seen, or you can join us, fight back, become a guardian yourself." As he spoke, images flashed through my mind. Other worlds, beautiful and terrible. The creatures I'd encountered, and worse ones, wreaking havoc across realities. But I also saw hope. People, humans and otherwise, standing against the darkness. I thought about my life before all this. My boring job, my failed relationships, the emptiness I'd felt that had driven me to go camping in the first place. And I realized that for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. I looked at the Guardians, my decision made. What do I need to do? The old man smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "First," he said, "you need to wake up." I blinked in confusion. "What?" The cave began to fade around me. The Guardians' faces blurred. I felt like I was falling. "Wake up, Reuben," the old man's voice echoed. "Wake up and remember, the real test is about to begin." My eyes snapped open. I was back in my RV, lying on the small bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream. Then I saw the note on the table, the one left by my tormentors. But now, there was something else written below their message, in a different hand, in letters that seemed to shimmer with an inner light. "The Nexus is real. The choice is yours. We'll be waiting." I stared at the note, my mind reeling. Was any of it real? The creatures, the Guardians, the Nexus? Or was it all part of some elaborate hallucination? As if in answer, I felt a tingling sensation in my hand. I looked down to see a small symbol appearing on my palm, an eye inside a triangle. It glowed faintly for a moment, then faded, leaving only a faint outline behind. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. Whether it was real or not, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay here. Whatever was happening, whatever force was at work, I needed answers. With newfound determination, I began to pack up the RV. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back to my old life, not after what I'd experienced. As I pulled out of the campground, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a group of robed figures standing at the edge of the forest, watching me go. But when I looked again, they were gone. I turned onto the main road, my hand steady on the wheel. I didn't know what lay ahead, what challenges or horrors I might face. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose. The game wasn't over. In fact, I realized it had only just begun. And this time, I intended to be more than just a pawn. As the RV picked up speed, carrying me towards an uncertain future, I couldn't help but smile. Whatever came next, I was ready. The real adventure was just beginning. I've always loved camping and hiking. There's something about the crisp mountain air, the rustling of leaves and the gentle babbling of streams that soothes my soul like nothing else. For years I've sought solace in the wilderness, escaping the chaos of city life to find peace among the trees. But one fateful trip changed everything, turning my sanctuary into a nightmare that continues to haunt me to this day. It was late September when I decided to take a solo RV camping trip to the Sierra Nevada foothills. Work had been stressful, and I desperately needed to clear my head. I chose a secluded spot off the beaten path, a place recommended by an old friend, Ralph. He swore by its tranquility and untouched beauty, describing it as a little slice of heaven. As I drove my RV along the winding mountain roads, the familiar excitement of a new adventure coursed through my veins. The further I got from civilization, the more my troubles seemed to melt away. By the time I reached the turnoff for the campsite, I was already feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The site was everything Ralph had promised and more. Nestled between towering pines, it offered a breathtaking view of a small, serene lake. The water sparkled in the late afternoon sun, its surface broken only by the occasional jump of a fish. I couldn't help but smile as I set up camp, feeling like I had stumbled upon my own private paradise. That first day was blissful. I spent the morning hiking around the lake, marveling at the diverse flora and fauna. In the afternoon, I tried my hand at fishing, managing to catch a couple of plump trout for dinner. As the sun began to set, I lit a campfire and prepared my meal, savoring the simple pleasure of food cooked over an open flame. After dinner, I leaned back in my camping chair, gazing up at the night sky. The stars were incredible out here, far from the light pollution of the city. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a cosmic river, and I felt small yet somehow connected to the vastness of the universe. It was well past midnight when I finally decided to turn in. I double-checked the locks on the RV out of habit before crawling into my sleeping bag. The gentle sounds of the forest lulled me to sleep, and for a few hours I slept more peacefully than I had in years. But then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke with a start. At first I couldn't pinpoint what had roused me. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual nighttime sounds conspicuously absent. I lay still, straining my ears when I heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon foraging for food. But a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The footsteps sounded too deliberate, too human. I reached for my phone, the screen's glow momentarily blinding me. 3:27 a.m. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the rational part of my brain insisted I investigate. After all, I was miles from the nearest town. If someone was out there, they might need help. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously stepped out of the RV. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, instantly banishing any lingering drowsiness. I swept the beam of light across the campsite, half expecting to see a startled animal scurrying away. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. At the edge of the light's reach stood a figure. Human-shaped but unnaturally still, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The figure remained motionless, watching. I took a tentative step forward, and that's when it moved, retreating into the shadows with unnatural speed. I stumbled backward, nearly falling in my haste to get back to the RV. Once inside, I locked the door and grabbed the small handgun I kept for emergencies. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat in the driver's seat, gun in hand, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. As the hours crawled by, my mind raced with possibilities. Was it a homeless person, a fugitive, or something else? When the first light of dawn finally broke, I wasted no time in packing up. Whatever I had seen, I had no desire to stick around and find out more. I drove to the nearest ranger station, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The ranger on duty, a grizzled old man named Jed, listened to my story with a grave expression. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "There have been rumors," he said slowly, "of people living off the grid in these parts, folks who don't take kindly to strangers." His words sent a chill down my spine. I thanked him for his time and drove back to the city, eager to put the whole experience behind me. But as the days passed, I began to notice things. A car that seemed to follow me for a few blocks too long. A stranger watching me a little too intently at the grocery store. At first I dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of my frightening experience. Then came the note. I found it slipped under my apartment door one evening, a single line scrawled on a piece of paper. "You should have stayed away." I took it to the police, but without any fingerprints or concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. From that moment on, I lived in a constant state of fear. Every shadow held a potential threat, every stranger a possible enemy. I installed new locks, bought security cameras, but nothing could shake the feeling that I was being watched. 2 nights ago, I heard someone outside my apartment. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing. In the morning, another note awaited me. "We're closer than you think." That was the last straw. I decided to confront Ralph, the friend who had suggested the campsite. When I showed up at his place unannounced, he seemed genuinely surprised to see me. I explained everything that had happened, watching his reaction closely. Ralph's confusion appeared genuine, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of fear, perhaps. "I swear I didn't tell anyone about your trip," he said. "But there is something I didn't mention before. That spot, it's been known to be, well, kinda sketchy. Some people say there's a cult out there, living in the woods." I felt as if the floor had dropped out from under me. "A cult? And you didn't think to mention this before?" Ralph had the decency to look ashamed. I didn't believe it. I thought it was just stories. Hell, I've camped there a few times myself without any trouble. I left Ralph's place feeling more confused and terrified than ever. If it was a cult, what did they want with me? Why were they following me? I knew I should go back to the police, but what could I tell them? That I was being stalked by a group of forest-dwelling cultists? No, I realized with a sinking feeling, this was something I would have to handle on my own. The next day I drove back to the campsite. It was a foolish decision, born of desperation and a need for answers. I armed myself this time, bringing not only my handgun but also a hunting rifle. As I approached the turnoff to the site, my hands were sweating so much I could barely grip the steering wheel. The campsite looked much as I remembered it, peaceful and inviting in the afternoon sun, but now I knew better. I parked the RV and began to search the area, looking for any signs of habitation or recent activity. After an hour of fruitless searching, I was about to give up when I spotted something through the trees, a flash of color that didn't belong in the forest. Cautiously, I made my way toward it. What I found sent a chill through my body. Hidden in a small clearing was a makeshift campsite. Tattered tarps stretched between trees formed crude shelters. The remains of a fire smoldered in a pit, wisps of smoke still rising from the embers. Food wrappers and other detritus were scattered about, suggesting recent occupation. I was examining a strange symbol carved into a tree trunk when I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around, rifle at the ready, to find myself face to face with a man. He was tall and unkempt, with wild eyes and a tangled beard. For a moment we just stared at each other, both too shocked to move. Then he bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Without thinking, I gave chase. We ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The man was fast, but fear and adrenaline propelled me forward. I caught up to him just as he stumbled over a fallen log. We went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the forest floor. He fought like a cornered animal, all nails and teeth, but I had the advantage of size and desperation. Finally, I managed to pin him down, pressing the barrel of my rifle against his chest. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, my voice hoarse and ragged. The man glared up at me, a mixture of fear and defiance in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come back," he spat. "Why? What do you want from me?" Before he could answer, a noise made me look up. My heart sank as I saw more figures emerging from the trees, encircling us. I counted 5 men, all armed, all looking as wild and unkempt as the one I had caught. "Let him go," one of them said, a big man with a deep, gravelly voice. "You're outnumbered." Slowly I got to my feet, keeping my rifle trained on the man I had tackled. "Who are you people?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The big man stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "We're just trying to live our lives," he said. "Off the grid, away from the corruption of society. You stumbled into our home." "That's all? You're just campers?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Not exactly. We've got our own ways, our own rules, and we don't like outsiders." I glanced around at the men surrounding me, realizing just how precarious my situation was. "I'll leave," I said. "I won't come back. Just let me go." The big man considered for a moment, then nodded. "That's wise. Take your things and go. Don't ever come back here." I backed away slowly, not lowering my rifle until I was sure they weren't going to shoot me in the back. When I reached my RV, I threw my gear inside and drove away as fast as I dared on the winding forest roads, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I went straight to the police station. This time they took my story more seriously. They sent a team out to investigate, but when they returned, they reported that the campsite was deserted. There was no sign of the men or their makeshift camp. Now I'm back in my apartment trying to make sense of it all. I've installed more security measures, changed my routines, even considered moving to a new city. But deep down I know it won't matter. Whatever I encountered out there in the woods, whatever strange group I stumbled upon, they know who I am. They know where I live. Every night I lie awake, listening for footsteps outside my door. Every shadow on the street could be one of them, watching, waiting. I don't know if they'll come for me again or what they want. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, has become a source of terror. The very thought of trees and mountains fills me with dread. I've sold my RV and camping gear, unable to even look at them without feeling a surge of panic. Sometimes in my darkest moments I wonder if I should have stayed in those woods, if perhaps joining their strange community would have been better than this constant fear. But then I remind myself of the madness I saw in their eyes, the barely contained violence in their movements. No, I made the right choice in escaping. But escape, I'm learning, is not the same as freedom. I may have left the forest, but I brought something back with me, an unshakable sense of being hunted, a knowledge that somewhere out there in the shadows of the Sierra, a group of men are watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. And so I wait too, caught in a limbo of fear and vigilance, wondering when, not if, they will make their next move. The wilderness I once loved has revealed its darkest secret, and I am forever changed by what I've seen. The peace I sought in nature has been replaced by a terror that follows me, even in the heart of the city. Every time my phone rings, every knock at the door, every unfamiliar face on the street, each is a potential harbinger of doom. I've become a prisoner of my own paranoia, the walls of my apartment both a sanctuary and a cage. As I write this, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Is that a shadow moving outside my window, or just a trick of the light? Is that a footstep in the hallway, or just my neighbor returning home? I don't know how this story ends. Perhaps one day I'll find the courage to confront my fears, to return to those woods and face whatever awaits me there. Or perhaps I'll spend the rest of my days looking over my shoulder, jumping at every unexpected sound. One thing is certain, I've always loved camping and hiking, but now the very thought of the wilderness fills me with a primal, unshakable dread. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are better left undiscovered.